Good morning. It's nice to see all of you here for our little workshop on 7 things you can do to help struggling kids. If any of you are curriculum directors, you'll like the notion that it doesn't cost much money, almost none. Before we get started, I probably need to tell you who I am. We have to shorten up a 2-day workshop into 55 minutes, so we'll even shorten up the introductions. As you look up here, you can see that I'm a pretty old guy. I don't mind being old. It's a privilege denied to many. I've been doing this a long time. I would like you to raise your hand if you are 53 years of age or younger. Yeah, hold them up nice and high. Perfect. Look around the room. You notice that's almost everybody in here? And this is what I probably should share with you. I have been teaching low-skilled, difficult, belligerent, poorly behaved kids who turn out to be nice for longer than you have been alive. And that is my primary criteria for being here today. Generally, I can take kids in pre-algebra. I work with them for a year and they improve their skills 2.5 to 3 grade levels in 1 year. I'll be sharing with you some of my tips and how you do that today. So let's get started. Thanks for being here. So Jim, you may be thinking, why 7 things? Why not 5? Why not 14? Why 7? And to answer that question, I have to draw on the work of 3 people you may have heard of. The first is a gentleman named Pareto. He lived in Italy, and in 1906, he discovered that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by just 20% of the people. That made him curious, and he looked at other countries in Europe and found exactly the same ratio. In fact, he found that ratio in so many social phenomena that he changed his life work from engineering to sociology, with a heavy statistical background, of course, and found that this 80-20 pattern exists in many places. Right after World War II, a gentleman named W. Edwards Deming took the concept of statistical process control and went to Japan because nobody in America would listen to him. And he taught the Japanese how to make cars that were better than American cars. And he cited the 80-20 rule. And he said that in every process, there are the vital few and the trivial many. And lately, I'm sure you guys have heard of John Hattie from Australia, originally of New Zealand. Hattie noticed that there were 240 things we do in education. Almost all of them work, some of them have negative effects, but he pointed out in visible learning that we should focus on what he called the hinge point, the high payoff for the least amount of effort. So I picked the 7 things that are the most effective, and I'm here to share them with you today. I have a confession to make. I am a pretty good teacher, but the first year I started teaching, I was the worst teacher that ever came out of Western Washington University. I was the worst teacher I've ever observed as a principal. I was the worst teacher I've ever worked with. I was so bad that I went to my principal at the end of the first year and I said, Kay, I know you need to let me go, but I'd really like to stay 1 more year. And besides, you can't find anybody else with my technical skills. And Kay was a pretty smart guy. He looked at me. Why? I said, well, I would really like to get good enough to quit so that I'm not walking away from here such a total failure. And he said, okay, we'll give it a shot. So how did I get better? In that second year, I actually turned it all around and became a good teacher. And I discovered an important thing to developing the knack for working with difficult kids. It's pretty simple. Do more of what works and do less of what doesn't work, and do that over and over again. And pretty soon, you can teach these guys. Eventually, I got an award, the Christian McAuliffe Award for Excellence in Teaching. So if I can do it, anybody can do it. And if we go through some of these things, maybe you won't have to spend 20 years getting the knack. Maybe you can shorten it up. Before we can really get into the 7 things and why they work, we have to understand that the kids that you're working with, the kids who struggle in math, are different than you are. Just by show of hands, hold up your hand if anybody in here needed to take Algebra 1 2 times in order to get a C or a D. Okay, almost nobody. Anybody admit to having to take it twice? And that's really the point, that the kids who are low achieving, The kids on the left-hand side of the normal curve, they're not like you. They are different. And they're different in ways that you can measure. And in order for us to be successful and implement the 7 things, we have to understand these kids are not like you were when you were a kid. And they are different in ways that we can know about, and they are different in ways that we can measure. So in order to be successful implementing the 7 things to help struggling students, you're going to have to give yourself permission to do things differently. In order to help these kids, you're going to have to go somewhere else first. I can't say it with that great Maine accent, but I'm sure you can imagine how it would sound. I invite your attention, by the way, to the rocking chair. I have a great artist that helps me with these projects. And without telling me, she slipped in the shape of the chair legs. In any case, in order to help these kids, you're going to have to go somewhere else first. And that somewhere is understanding why they are not like you and why those differences make the 7 things work. Hey, let's look at these backpacks. How many of you have taught low-level math classes and seen these backpacks before? Raise your hand. These backpacks are the great hallmark of low achieving, and they kind of provide the key to understanding why kids struggle with math. I had the great fortune to be the principal of the worst high school in the state of Washington, and that's a whole separate story and a whole separate book. But I noticed right away that every kid in that school had a backpack that looked like this. And it turned out the reason you weren't successful at the big school and the reason you came to the alternative school was not because you'd been incarcerated. There's kids at the big school on probation. Not because you used drugs. Kids at the big school use drugs. And not because you have babies. Kids at the big school have babies. What these kids all had in common, and I mean almost 100%, was backpacks jammed full of undone, unfinished, crumpled up assignments. Some of them were done, but they just never turned them in. Now, these backpacks happen to be from Yelm High School when I taught pre-algebra there. I know you guys don't teach pre-algebra anymore. You teach algebra with an asterisk. But if you look at the backpacks of the kids who aren't succeeding, they're going to look like this. And the reason they look like this is that all of these kids, in the words of Myers-Briggs, are P learning style. These are guys that don't do homework, and there's good reasons for that. Let me share some examples with you. So who are these struggling math students with the nasty backpacks full of unfinished, crumpled, dirty assignments? They are, in the words of Myers-Briggs, all P learning styles. So let me ask you a question. How many of you guys make lists? Raise your hand. See, almost all of you make lists. Okay, put your hands down. How many of you make a list, and then if you do something that's not on the list, you write it down so you can check it off? That's me. Like you, raise your hands if that's you. You and I are hardcore J's. We finish everything. We even finish books that we started that we don't want to read. That's what we do. That's how we are. We make schedules. We make plans. We keep deadlines. And we're pretty darn smug about it because we get things done. So the kids you're working with, they're all P's, to use the Myers-Briggs terminology. And P's don't make lists. Never make a list. They never check anything off. They don't like calendars. I have a 40-year-old daughter, and my wife must have bought her 500 calendars over the years, enough to stock a stationery store. Some of them got used for scratch paper. Most of them just went in the garbage. These P kids, they're easily distracted. They never say, hey, wait just a second, I need to finish this problem. If you're offering a conversation while they're working, they are more than happy to turn their attention to you. They don't like schedules. One time I was writing on my calendar, I got to do graduation at noon on June 20th. And one of my students said, Slosson, how can you live like that? My God, that's horrible. What do you mean? I'd lay awake every night thinking June 20th, I got to be in Tacoma at noon. I said, well, how would you do it? And he responded, well, on June 20th, if I remembered, I'd drive up to Tacoma and go to graduation. Okay, what if you don't have a ticket? They won't let you in. Well, let's go do something else. So these kids they lose everything. They lose their assignments, and it's the key to why they won't do homework. So You guys are not like this. Let me show you some data that I've collected over the years. I have tested about 4,000, 5,000 kids, every kid in the alternative school and every kid in every math class I've had since. So let me share some data with you about these kids and their learning style, and you, math teachers, and your learning style. And yes, there are exceptions. What we're looking for here is trends to help us understand why these kids struggle so. The primary focus of the 7 things I'm going to share with you today is about accommodating the style of these P learners that haven't been very successful. And we need to accommodate their style because they are certainly not going to accommodate our teaching style. I taught math at Yelm High School and Ridgeline Middle School in the Yelm School District. For 8 years, I intended to stay 3, but it was too much fun and I couldn't quit. And during that time, I kept track of all the learning styles of all my students and added that to my database. And this slide just happens to illustrate the results for one school year of 3 classes. We had 90-minute periods. And before I get into the hash marks, I would like you to look at the order in which the learning styles are written. So if you don't know Myers-Briggs, you need to take the test just for fun. It's far more accurate than horoscopes and a lot of fun. So you'll notice that INTJ learning styles are at the top. These guys will always get the highest grades given the same intellect and the same amount of work. And the guys down at the bottom always get the lowest grade for the same amount of effort and work. And that just has to do with schools. Schools like kids who have calendars and who keep track of things and keep their assignments neat and clean and turn them in on time. Schools don't have a lot of patience for people who lose their papers, don't do their homework, forget that we were having a test tomorrow. So that is just the way things go. Some guys with learning styles like me always get a higher grade, even if I don't deserve it. So I kept track of all these kids, and we did a tally sheet, and you will notice that all of the stuff below the neutral line, that is the kids enrolled in math classes that I teach, pre-algebra struggling students, they're almost all Ps. And the others are distributed fairly evenly, but the P learning style dominates. That goes right back to those backpacks. And if you had done teachers like I did over the years, you would discover that teachers are most frequently, not always, but most frequently they are Js who get things done, and they are thinkers rather than feelers. That's not always true, but it's true more than it's not. And most often they are people who are intuitive learners and who get the big picture and the idea first rather than sequential learners who tend to learn things in order, plotting order. Sometimes you have to learn all the parts before you can understand the whole. So that creates a real dysfunction between the teachers who are totally different than their kids and understand why can't you get your work done and why can't you get it done on time? Well, and how are they going to learn? I need to share with you. You need to know the 7 things because you can't change their learning style. When they're 45 years old, they're going to show up to sign a mortgage and they aren't going to bring a pen and they aren't going to have their last pay stub. Somebody's going to have to fax it over because that's how they are. And trying to change them isn't going to work. There's not enough F's in the world that will change the way they learn. All right, finally you're thinking, I thought he'd never get there. This is the list of 7 things. And I won't read it to you because I assume unlike school board members, you can actually read. Have you ever noticed at every school board meeting, they get up there and they read the slideshow to the people? The student-teacher relationships are at the top because they are the most important. And I'll explain that in a minute. But you are not their buddy, you are not their friend, but you are their friendly teacher, and your ability to get them to learn math is going to totally depend on your ability to connect with them on a level that's more personal. I'm going to suggest some games and things you can do, but I'm also going to suggest that during your instruction is a time to build relationships and understanding. Other things on the list, they are kind of in order. You're going to need to change the way you do instruction. You need to talk less. You need to walk around the room more. And you can facilitate that when you change the kids into groups of 4. You need to make every day a graded day. Every day, kids do an assignment. Every day it gets graded and entered into the book. And that's going to help you immensely with discipline. And believe it or not, it's going to make your workday shorter. Every kid does an assignment every day. It's graded. It goes in the grade book, and I'm out of there 30 minutes after the bell rings. It makes it easier. I know it seems counterintuitive, but we'll explain that. And I'm going to suggest a different way of testing. I'm going to suggest that we go way back and pull a page out of the Thomas Guskey playbook, and we go to a mastery model for testing. And then finally, I'm going to give you the 7th thing, which you probably can't do, but at least you know it's available and would work if you could do it. So let's go through these items one by one. They're very powerful. They're the 7 most important things that I've figured out in 50 years. I told John Hattie I've developed my own canon for instruction. Of all the 7 items, the most important and comes first is relationships. If you don't do anything else on this list, if you work on relationships, math scores will go up and your life will be easier when you work with low-achieving kids. I was working in the Elm School District. They gave me 3 sections of pre-algebra, and they were some pretty tough kids. They had not passed a math class in 2 years. And so they all came to me, and it worked. We were sitting in a circle about the 4th month, and I'm next to a student named Emily. And Emily turns to me and says, "Slosson, do you really like us? Or do you just pretend to like us so that we'll get higher test scores and you'll have a shiny little star?" I looked at Emily and I said, "Emily, that's a pretty smart question for a 14-year-old. You must be a pretty smart person." She goes, "Well, yeah, actually, I am pretty smart, just not at math. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in your loser math class." So I said to Emily, "So do you think I could fool you for 4.5 months?" She said, "No, nobody can fool me for 4.5 months. Holy cow, you actually do like us. Why? We're loud, we're rude, we don't do any work, we screw around when you want us to listen. I don't get it, Slosson." Huh. And we'll leave that for there now. There's another end to the Emily story. Okay, so how do you build community in a busy classroom? Why should you give up some of your precious instructional minutes in order to spend time creating relationships? Well, you should do it because if you spend 10 minutes a day for the first month of class, the rest of the year will be a breeze. They'll learn a lot more and behavior problems will be diminished. What can you do? Greet them at the door as they come in, hand them their assignment, say their name, shake hands if that's what you do in your school, and ask them a personal question. How's your pet doing? Did you catch any fish? Is the Quinceañera planning coming along? Those sorts of things. The sponge activity, remember the sponge activity? I just make it the first 2 questions on today's assignment so they can work on that while I'm getting my act together. I know they know how to do it because it's old stuff. After the greeting, an important thing to do at the beginning of your class in the fall is call home. I know that's tough, man. It's not something we really like to do. But the calls can be quick. You can say, "Hi, this is Mr. Slosson. I'm Bob's math teacher. I just wanted to touch bases with you and let him know that we're going to have a great year. And Bob's going to tell you there's no homework in this class." And that's absolutely true. And you can explain why that's so. But the really most powerful technique that you've got is to interview each kid. Now, it's going to look different depending on the grade level. 9th graders, we spend 10 minutes at the beginning of every single period, and we practice audience behaviors, we practice participation behaviors, and we interview each kid. Where do you live in the district? Do you have any pets? Do you have your chores at home? Where did you go to elementary school? A lot of those kinds of questions. And that settles the whole class down, gets them ready to work, gets them ready for the 10 minutes where I'm going to explain the assignment that they're working on today, and gets them in the frame of mind where they want to work and be part of the class. You want them to come to class because they like being there so much. Now, there's lots of other kinds of things you can do. I've even done show and tell. Last semester, we had kids mail me pictures of their pets, and we had one of those short days with a double assembly thing. So we just showed pictures of our pets during class time. I'll have one more story to tell you, but I want to change the slide. Well, to wrap this up, I'll tell you one more story, because with me, it's always one more story. I I was doing a workshop north of Marysville. I won't say the name of the district because the lady's probably still working there. In the book, I think I call her Tina, but her real name is Gail. And Gail was apparently forced to be in my workshop. She taught calculus, pre-calc, and advanced stats. And she wasn't buying a thing I was saying. She sat there for 2 days with her arms folded. She was tapping her foot. She was looking at the clock, and I could just see her thinking, I got a million things more important to do than listen to some shop teacher tell me how to teach math. It doesn't matter. I told her I wasn't teaching her math. I was teaching her about kids. But anyway, so the class ended. She went away. I came back in about 6 months, and I did a follow-up work in service for the whole district. And much to my surprise, Tina was sitting right in the front row. So I greeted everybody in the class, and I don't usually do this, but this particular day, I don't know, maybe I was a little miffed from the last time. And I said, Tina, I'm really surprised to see you here today. I didn't think you were buying much of what I was selling. And she said, could I talk to the class, Jim? Sure. I said, but I'll sign off anything. You don't have to stay here if somebody's making you be here. She said, no, I'm here of my own choice. And she stood up and faced the class and said, Jim's right. I was very rude, and I want to apologize and tell you a short story. I was assigned to pre-algebra last year, and that was the class from hell. Those kids hated me, and I hated them, and we all knew it. And the clock just crawled every day. My stomach would churn before they came in. I'd have to go to the bathroom after they left. They were rude, really difficult kids. And I thought, what the heck? I have nothing to lose, she said. I'm going to try the interviews that Jim gave us. And she happened to win a set of cards. So she tried it. And she said, within 2 weeks, I was the most beloved teacher in the whole math department. It completely turned the class around. And I'm going to always include some time for relationship building in my classes that are struggling. And I was thinking, well, it wouldn't hurt to do it in calculus either. But anyway, Tina ended up being a real believer in the notion of relationships make teaching easier. And I really appreciated the fact that she was willing to share that with the class. Well, gosh almighty fish hooks. My grandpa used to say that. Have no idea what it means. I'd like you to indulge me for a second and imagine your most difficult class. You're standing up there at front of the board. I want you to close your eyes, look around the room, and see those kids. And probably what you're going to see is the A kids are sitting in the front row, and some of them are kind of in the middle. And then clustered behind the B kids in the middle row, you've got the C kids on each side. And if you look back in the left corner and the right corner, there's going to be 3 to 5 guys dinking around on their phones, not paying any attention to what you say. And those are your F kids. Well, if you can go to every day is a greater day and change the way kids are seated in your classroom, that can go away. That's why every day is a graded day and there's no homework. Those guys back in the corner weren't doing the homework anyway. They're P's. They couldn't remember it, they couldn't find it, and they didn't want to do it anyway. So we're going to change that. So every day is a graded day. You're going to introduce the topic. You're going to have them do some work and show you how they do it while you walk around the room. And then you're going to grade the papers in their work groups, and those papers are going to be graded before they leave the room. You are not going to be sitting behind stacks of paper. So a little trick about grading. A finished paper is worth 5. If they started it but didn't do a good job, it's only a 1. And if they weren't there, it's 0. So why does this work? Well, what happens is you're only accepting quality work to get a 5. And it only takes them a little while to learn, wow, I got to get a 5 or it doesn't count. And since you have table groups of 4, nobody at the table group can look at their phone until everybody in the table group has completed the paper correctly, neatly, and earned a 5. And you'll just walk around and chat with the kids, and they'll slide their papers over to you, and you'll give them 5s, and then they will collect them and turn them in at the end of the period. And you won't have to do anything except enter those papers into your grade book. It's a great system and kids learn a lot more, and you're not frustrated with homework they didn't do. Now, you'll have to make some instructional changes to make this happen. We'll look at that in the next slide. If you take 28 P learning style kids in a pre-algebra class or an algebra class with an asterisk, even a geometry class, and you tell them to open the book, go to page 87, do the 12 odd problems on that page on your own paper, and turn those in Monday, I can pretty well tell you what's going to happen, and you know it too. They're not going to do it. They just don't do problems out of books. They don't like to transfer the data over. They don't like to show their work. But if you take those same kids and you give them a handout with 10 problems on the front and 10 on the back, and you tell them, hey, this is due at the end of the period, and of course you're in your cooperative groups, I expect every problem to be answered correctly. You need to show all your work. Nowadays, I tend to write the answer spaces over on the right-hand side. The first time I did this, they were kind of dispersed around the paper, but it's much easier to grade them if it's just a bunch of blanks on the right-hand side. Sometimes I put in the answers and make them show me the work. And showing the work on every problem every day, because every day is a graded day, is a big part of the class. Kids balk at that. They don't want to show their work. They like to guess and check. I taught geometry last semester, and they had a bunch of trig problems to do, and the guys would say, well, I don't really need to show all my work because I did it all in the calculator. And I'd go, well, that's really great. Then you can just show me every keystroke you did on the calculator. That'll be just fine. And they balk. They don't want to show their work. But due at the end of the period, rolling review is a critical piece of this. That means we're going to cover some stuff from before this lesson, and we're going to do it at the end of the lesson, 2 or 3 problems. I'll talk about that more on the next slide. So where do these daily assignments come from? Well, I generally just write them myself. The publishers don't provide them. I print some base sheets for the whole class, and then each time I want an assignment, I just write it out by hand in pen, makes it easy to copy. Like nowadays, I tend to put the answers over on the right-hand side. This was before I learned that trick. On this particular assignment, it's about the 3rd week, 4th week, and we're working on circles, and they just struggle with circles. Oh my gosh. You can do that over and over every year. They never quite get C and D connect by 3, and radius looks like half to me, although they do memorize it eventually. And if you'll notice over there on the right-hand side, the last problems are review from things we did earlier, multiplying some fractions in the Pythagorean theorem. These guys cannot get enough review. Through the entire semester, we put this rolling review into each assignment. Now, they'll do this assignment. They'll help each other. This one's a little short, although it depends on the class. And I might add a few questions because I'll have some kids that'll finish this lickety-split. And so I might add what I call smarty pants questions. Let's look at a later assignment and a different example. I forgot to mention that these sheets are taken from what I called AGA, Algebra, Geometry, Arithmetic. It was my pre-algebra class in Yom. I got to work on this for 8 years, so I had it pretty well refined by the time I was done. This is the 18th week of class, maybe the 20th. We are reviewing the linear equations that they never learned in 7th and 8th grade. You notice the equations are pretty simple. On this particular lesson, I probably went straight from our activity of the morning and just had them start working because I looked at the previous lessons and they knew how to do it. Notice we've still got the rolling review on the right down there at the bottom. And I need to spend just a second explaining the grading. If a kid is absent, you give them a 0. You don't leave a blank or an asterisk on the grade sheet. Zeros get their attention and they get in there and they make up that work. All the work has to be done. If you're absent, you still make up the work. If you finish it and you do a good job, you get a 5. If you don't do it, or if you were there and you don't do it, or if you do a lousy job, you get a 1. We don't do any 2, 3, or 4 business. This has the unintended consequence, as far as they can see, of driving them towards quality work, more of a pass-fail. You have to learn everything. If you start to give them 2 or 3s, they start trying to give you crappy work. And we don't want crappy work. We want complete work, we want quality work, and we want everything done at the end of the period. This was a pretty short lesson if the kids actually remember it. So I probably, and I don't really remember, I probably added 2 or 3 smarty pants questions for the kids that want to get an A+. And we'll talk about that. Turns out once every kid does every assignment every day and does it well, grades start to go up and people start to wonder why you're giving so many B's and A's. Well, it's because they're learning everything, but that creates some social problems all on its own. Once you start to build community in your classroom and do activities and kids are eager to get to class every day, and once you start to use every day as a graded day assignments, you're going to have an interesting problem. You're going to have too many A's and B's. And what are you going to do about that? So I would like you to think for a moment about who's going to be upset with too many A's. There, I waited 1.2 seconds. There will be a few parents, even though it's a pre-algebra class, that are going to be upset because everybody got an A and now my kid is less special. A's are cheap. The fact that they earned them will go unnoticed. But the other constituency that might be a little upset about your easy grading, I'm using air quotes here, is the other teachers. They will probably dismiss you as an easy grader and not want to recognize that you're actually getting way more work out of these kids. So you're going to have a lot of A's and you'll have a few kids that have the need to excel. So we came up here with smarty pants points on every assignment. I add 1 or 2 questions so a kid can earn 6 or 7 points on a 5-point test. And at the end of the semester, if you have more than 100%, you're eligible for a smarty pants certificate, an A+ certificate. And I'll have to say, last year I had all those A's and B's. Out of 105 kids, only 7 decided they wanted to be more than 100%. But what I really like about this is it puts the notion if you want to excel and be exceptional, it's in your own hands. It's not about how smart God made you, it's just how hard you work. That's just works out really well. And while we're looking at this, I wanted to mention, I forgot this, the nice thing about a 1-5 grading scale is that you can provide accommodations for special ed kids that are invisible. If you have 20 problems, you may only require some kids to do 15, but only you will know that that's the correct number. That won't be out there for everybody to see. And that is a nice feature of the 0-1-5 grading system. I was an administrator who observed teachers for 11 years, and I was a math coordinator for 3 years, and I observed many more math teachers in that capacity. And I'm a sub who wanders around and just kind of listens in the hallway as I walk past. I need to share with you that more than 80% of our math teachers are spending more than 80% of their time talking. And I think maybe that's not the best ratio. Math is not performance art. I can promise you that there will never come a day when the kids will stand up and start applauding and say, "Oh my gosh, Mr. Slosson, thank you so much for teaching us the X method of factoring. It's going to work so well." That's not going to happen. Well, gosh, what could instruction look like if we did less talking and more walking? It would take you 2 to 3 minutes to take roll. If you include an activity, 10 minutes total. Then you can use 10 minutes for instruction and showing youngsters how to do what it is we're going to do today. 10's about as long as they're going to listen. And then you could put them to work on the worksheets that they've got in front of them. And you could walk around and check. You could check for understanding. You can make sure they're working. You can tell them to put their phones away. If you see a student who's struggling, you can ask another student to help them out. Or you could sit down and chat for just a second. "How's it going, guys? Hey, would you like me to do a free problem? I'll do that for you. Pick the one you want." You could check their work. You could move to another table and say, "Are you guys ready to be graded?" And you can gather valuable data about how today's lesson went as you watch them work, and you could reteach and modify that tomorrow. Talk about an evaluation loop. You've got feedback right there. So I'm going to suggest that you are not the sage on the stage, as I like to say in the coaching circles. Rather, you are the supervisor of a group of people doing important work. They are building knowledge and skill, and your job is to make sure they get that job done and that they feel good about the work they've accomplished. 10 minutes talking, 35 minutes walking. I think rows are just horrible. You can't get around, you can't move, you can't see what the kids are doing. Circles are the very best way to teach math. However, most rooms aren't nearly big enough to put 35 kids in a circle. I was out at Yelm and I had the toughest class in the world, the tire slashers, as I mentioned before. And they were so difficult. I had a room full of tables, but I had a gigantic room. So I arranged the tables in a circle, and to do instruction, they would sit on the inside of the circle. They all had a slate on their lap and a whiteboard marker, and they would practice while I demonstrated the skills for today. And then it was time to go to work on their worksheets. They all had to turn facing the outside of the circle. And this room was so big, I could then walk around the outside of the circle and I could see every student in the room. I never had my back to anybody. I could bend down and help a kid and still watch everybody, and there were no corners to hide in. Unfortunately, almost no classrooms are big enough for circles. But I think there's a reason why we should look at table groups. It's a wonderful way to teach, and I'd like to explain further why I think rows are such a bad idea. I already told you how much I hate rows. Table groups are great. 3 would be the best configuration, but generally rooms aren't big enough to accommodate 3. 4 seems to be the right number. And the great thing about 4 is now instead of supervising 32 kids, you're supervising 8 groups. That makes life a lot easier. You will need an introvert row. You're going to have a few kids that are just so shy and so socially awkward that they will almost cry if they have to sit with other people. So I'm going to suggest you save a few seats for the introverts. The other thing you need to know about table groups and seating and rows is the information that they gathered down in Los Angeles. Back when I was sort of at the start of my career, they did a bunch of research called Teacher Expectations Student Achievement. That was called TESSA, and their data is really worth looking at. If kids can pick their own seats, they'll come in the room and they will tend to seat in a specific order. The A's will tend to cluster in the front and down the middle. The kids that are going to get B's and C's a little farther back. And the kids who plan to get an F or a D generally sit in the far back corners. They intuitively know the teacher is going to look there less and call on those seats less. In fact, if you go down to that young man in the far left corner messing with his phone and say, well, why did you pick this seat? And if they're honest and if they think you won't punish them, they'll say, well, because nobody ever calls on you when you sit here. So that's an interesting aspect of letting kids sit in rows, besides the fact that you can't walk around. They have already decided what their grade is based on where they're going to sit. Most often when you teach low-level math classes like pre-algebra or algebra asterisk, they only give you 24 students, which is a pretty good deal because you can have just 6 table groups. It pays to put a little thought into who will be sitting with whom in these table groups. When I was a youngster, they stressed sociograms and cross-cultural connections and diversity. Well, that's all great, except you live in the real world. And what I've found that works the best is to let kids pick a partner. So give everybody a piece of paper. Each one writes down who they want to sit with. And you decide which pairs sit together. And that generally works out. Occasionally, you'll get some youngster who'll say, Mr. Slosson, I wrote down Linda, but please don't put us together because we always get in trouble. But don't tell her I said that. So there's always some drama involved in who sits with whom. But it's been my experience that after a week or two, everybody settles in. If you have to make an adjustment and move somebody, you can do that. Don't put the A's together, waste of talent. Don't put 4 F's at the same table. They'll just reinforce each other's failure. So mix it up a little bit, usually works out just fine. Remember Pareto and the 80-20 rule? Well, it applies to discipline too. In fact, when I was an intern, I kept track of all of the discipline steps at North Thurston High School for an entire year. And this was before there was Excel. And I made an interesting discovery. It wasn't what I expected. 50% of all discipline steps went to freshman boys. 30% of all discipline steps went to, guess in your mind, sophomore girls. I was a little surprised. So 80% of all the discipline steps in a school went to just 20% of the students. Actually, it was 25%. That's kind of interesting. Well, it turns out when it comes to discipline and the Pareto principle, there's a little math involved. So 20% of your kids are causing 80% of your problems. So let's do a little math. 0.8 times 0.8 is 64%, and 0.2 times 0.2 is 0.04. So 4% of the kids are causing 64% of the discipline problems in your school. And guess what? They're in your class. Because when you sort kids for ability 3 times, you've sorted them for discipline twice. Now, you could probably make the argument that low grades caused bad discipline, or bad discipline caused low grades. It's not really relevant. The kids that are going to be in your class are going to be a discipline problem, and you're going to have to figure out how to deal with that if you're going to get them to learn math. I'm going to suggest that you need to embrace this problem and teach discipline. Let's look at the next slide. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on discipline today because that's a whole course all by itself. I've taught it for 3 credits and I've taught it for 5 credits along with classroom management. Once you have gone to the notion of community building in your classroom and you've got kids working hard every day, with every day is a great day, a lot of discipline will tend to go away. But you're going to have some kids that have a lot of history of misbehaving in class to get out of work and other negative behaviors. I want to suggest to you that discipline is not about punishing wrong behavior so much as it is about teaching correct behavior. I always like a theme. The theme for my classes, because I'm always working with 8th, 9th, and above, is that we are learning the habits of highly employable young adults in this classroom. And I have a list of behaviors of the way that I think teenagers should act if they want to become highly employable young adults. And we try to teach to the positive. But we actually have lesson plans. We have a lesson about walking into the room when you're late, walking into the room when you're upset or angry. We learn how to shake hands. We learn how to resolve differences. So teaching discipline is just going to be part of the class. I like real specific rules. I like to make sure that that set of rules go home to parents and come back signed copy. In fact, that's the only non-math thing for which I give points, is returning your discipline steps signed by your parents. So the other thing you're going to have to deal with, and I can go on this at great length in the workshop, there are a few kids, not many, just a few, that you cannot fix. And you're going to have to work with an administrator to find a solution. Sometimes they'll just work better for another teacher. But I want to remind you, and I can't say this enough if you're a young teacher, you are not these kids' friend. You are their friendly teacher. And don't get overly friendly, because if they get in trouble, they will rat you out in a heartbeat. That is all of their programming up to the time they met you. So discipline is a big issue, only if it's a big issue. Once it's fixed, it's not an issue at all. Kids come to us in the fall full of hope. This is going to be the year. This is going to be the year I'm going to turn it around. And they take a test and they don't do quite as well as they'd hoped. And then they take another test and it's worse. And by the time they've taken the 3rd test and each score is lower, they pretty much give up. I think the way we test is part of the problem. Right now, every place I go, you take the test, and if you don't do very well, you get to take a makeup test, but there's some penalty for it. And my experience with kids who are low achieving, that have a P learning style, if they know they're going to get 2 chances, they're just going to blow off the first chance. So the way I like to do it is that we prepare to take the test. We do a little review. And then we take what's called the practice test. And the practice test is the same as the real test, except because it's math, I've just changed the numbers around. And so they take the practice test, and they know if they get 80% on the practice test, they will be excused from the real test. On test day, they can sit out in the hall and listen to their video, or they can play on their phone, or they can do their AP homework, whatever they want to do. But the whole notion of a practice test changes the paradigm of testing, and they're trying to beat the system and get a good grade on that practice test. Now, here's the funny thing. If a kid who's not used to getting 80% gets 80%, and you say, hey, would you like to take the real test and try for an A? Most of them will take you up on it. That's why I generally have more A's than B's. Not so many kids will say, oh, B's good enough for me. A few will do that, obviously. But a guy named Thomas Guskey wrote about this whole notion of mastery learning and the testing. And I have had great luck by having two tests. First one's a practice, second one's a regular test. And then if I got a kid who still isn't getting it, a lot of times I'll bring them in at lunchtime and we'll go through that test one question at a time. And when they've got that, I'll give them an alternate question and I will raise their grade. Although if you've gone to that extent, the maximum grade I give you is 80%. So just a word on testing. Again, another whole topic. But I think if you make that one little change in the way you test, you'll see much better results. I know that a lot of folks like to use the publisher's test. For one thing, everybody in the department uses the same test. But I think there's a problem with using publisher's tests. They're written so that they cover the scope and sequence of the book. And the book is written so it meets up with the standards for your grade level. And you know what? There are way too many standards for you to teach and test in a single year. So my particular method is to write the final test with an understanding of what it was they were trying to do in the book or whatever materials we're using, and then use this final to develop the unit tests, and then from the unit tests to actually develop the lessons, so that when you're all done, you end up with a coordinated system that you're teaching the kids what you're going to test them, and you test them what they're going to teach them. Not unlike the way we train surgeons and airline pilots. Finally, number 7 of the vital few. God, I know you thought it was never going to get there. I'm not going to spend much time on 7. I know it would work like gangbusters, but I don't think you can do it. Too many things affect the schedule. Your administrators have lots of conflicts to resolve. They have to start with the music schedule, then we have buses, then they have the conflicts between AP and chemistry, and it's just never ending. But if you could have the same kids in algebra that you had back in pre-algebra, you would save 2 or 3 months of instruction. The only time I ever experienced this was that I had the same kids in an after-school algebra program that I had in the pre-algebra program, and those kids just really excelled. We got them all through Algebra 1, and they did very well. In those days, I think the test was the CFAS. So I don't think you can do it, but if you could, it would be marvelous. If you want to come over, I'll buy you a soda and tell you why the master schedule algorithm will not allow it. But if you could do it, it would be great. Probably somewhere in the last few minutes, you took a deep breath and said, yeah, I'm sure that would probably work. It's too much work. I would like to tell you that it's really not too much work. It seems like it at first because it's not what you're used to. You have to give yourself permission to do things differently and not be the same as everybody else who's teaching math in your school. I'd like to share with you the results. I went into a geometry class February 8th of last year, and I was there till the end of the semester. The kids weren't real happy when we went to a graded assignment every day. Every day being a graded day was new to them. They developed a happiness as they discovered they wouldn't have to do any homework. And they liked the testing protocol. They were always trying to get out of taking the regular test, and so many of them retook the test. I think I gave out 8 or 9, maybe 12 A+ certificates. But you'll notice A's is the largest group because it turns out if you got 80% on the test, hey, why not take it over and get 95 or 100? So lots of A's. Few B's, few C's, a couple of D's. Those guys were interesting. They weren't going to pass, and that's a whole different issue. They took the jackpot final. They were actually pretty capable, but they hadn't done any work. And then you'll notice F's is right up there, almost as many as the C's. And you know, it doesn't matter how good you are. You can't teach a young man or woman that won't come to school. So You're going to have to expect some F's because you can't fix everybody, but gosh, you fix the ones you can, and it turns out to be quite a few. If you'd like some further information, I do have a website. It's prealgebra.net, or you can email me, jim@prealgebra.net. On that website, you'll find a bunch of free things that can help you out. There's an article on why math facts matter, and if your kids don't know math facts, what you can do about that. There is some section with free resource sheets that your kids can use in class, and a bunch of other materials, and of course, a link to my book if you'd like to buy that. Again, thank you guys so much for being here. What a great pleasure. It's a great profession. We are so lucky that we can actually make meaningful changes in the lives of young people. Thanks.